"You're making me look bad. Stay away from me tonight," my girlfriend Scarlett whispered harshly as I approached her group at the company holiday party. The words hit me like a physical blow, delivered with such casual cruelty that I almost wondered if I'd misheard her. I had been excited about this evening for weeks, finally getting the chance to meet her colleagues after 6 months of dating, putting on my best shirt and rehearsing conversation starters about her marketing projects. I had arrived 15 minutes after the party started, scanning the crowded hotel ballroom until I spotted Scarlett near the bar in her red dress, laughing with a group of people I assumed were her coworkers. My stomach had been full of nervous excitement as I walked over, genuinely looking forward to being introduced as her boyfriend and learning more about the professional world she talked about constantly but never let me into. Instead of the warm introduction I expected, she grabbed my arm and pulled me several steps away from her group, her manicured nails digging into my jacket sleeve as her expression shifted from party bright to something cold and annoyed. She gestured dismissively toward me as if I were some unwelcome intrusion, explaining in a low, urgent voice that her coworkers didn't know about our relationship because she preferred keeping her personal life completely separate from work. According to her, my presence here was complicating things in ways I couldn't possibly understand, and the best thing I could do was find somewhere else to be for the rest of the evening. The way she said it made it sound like I was some embarrassing family member who had crashed a sophisticated adult event, not her boyfriend of 6 months who had been specifically invited. I stood there processing her words while the party continued around us, watching her colleagues glance over curiously at our hushed conversation before she quickly composed herself and returned to their circle. The realization settled over me with devastating clarity that she had been hiding me from her professional circle entirely, treating me like something shameful rather than someone she cared about. I watched from my new position several feet away as she immediately resumed laughing and engaging with the group, her body language open and animated in a way it hadn't been moments earlier when she was talking to me. What struck me most wasn't just the rejection itself, but how effortlessly she switched between treating me like a burden and being charming with everyone else. I noticed how she lit up when talking to the tall guy in the expensive suit, how she touched his arm during conversation and leaned in close when he spoke, displaying an intimacy and comfort that felt more natural than anything I'd seen between us lately. When I tried to catch her eye from across the room, hoping for some acknowledgement or maybe even an apologetic smile, she looked right through me as if I were part of the hotel furniture, continuing her animated conversation without missing a beat. The rejection stung deeper than any argument we'd ever had because it wasn't passionate or emotional, it was calculated and cold, delivered with the kind of practiced efficiency that suggested she'd been thinking about this scenario for a while. I realized that this wasn't about keeping work and personal life separate, it was about keeping me separate because I didn't fit the image she wanted to project to these people. Standing alone in a room full of strangers while my girlfriend pretended I didn't exist, I began to understand that I had been living in a relationship where I was seen as a liability rather than a partner, someone to be managed and hidden rather than celebrated and shared. Instead of leaving immediately like my wounded pride demanded, I decided to observe from my position across the room, nursing a bourbon and watching Scarlett's behavior with the kind of fresh perspective that only comes from sudden emotional distance. I positioned myself near a tall cocktail table where I could see her clearly while appearing to check my phone, giving myself the cover of looking busy rather than abandoned. What I witnessed over the next hour was like watching a masterclass in social manipulation, as Scarlett transformed into different versions of herself depending on who she was talking to. I noticed how she lit up around certain male colleagues in ways that made my chest tighten with recognition, particularly when she was talking to Derek from the marketing department, the same tall guy in the expensive suit I'd observed earlier. Her body language around him was completely different from how she acted with me, more animated and engaged, touching his arm during conversations and leaning in close when he spoke as if they shared intimate secrets. She laughed at his jokes with genuine enthusiasm, the kind of bright, musical laugh I remembered from our early dates but hadn't heard directed at me in months. When a woman approached their group and Derek introduced her as his girlfriend Emma, I watched Scarlett's entire demeanor shift in real time, like someone had flipped a switch that dimmed her inner light. Her posture became more rigid and professional, her smile more practiced and less genuine, and she stepped back from Derek's personal space with the kind of calculated movement that suggested she'd been crossing boundaries she knew existed. The contrast was so stark it was almost comical, watching her transform from flirtatious colleague back to generic work associate within seconds of realizing Derek was unavailable. As I continued my silent observation, pieces of our relationship began falling into place like a puzzle I'd been trying to solve without knowing I was missing crucial pieces. Her reluctance to post photos of us together on social media suddenly made sense, as did her evasiveness about work events and her frequent girls' nights that she never wanted to discuss in detail. I remembered how she always changed the subject when I asked about her day at work, claiming it was too boring to talk about, and how she'd grown irritated when I suggested meeting her for lunch near her office. The painful realization dawned that I had been serving as a placeholder in her life, someone convenient and reliable for weekends and quiet evenings but not worthy of public acknowledgement or integration into her professional identity. I thought about all the times she'd criticized my choice of restaurants as not impressive enough, my clothes as too casual for certain venues, and my conversation topics as not sophisticated enough for mixed company. What I'd interpreted as her trying to help me improve was actually her managing the embarrassment she felt about being seen with me. Standing there with my drink growing warm in my hand, I understood that tonight hadn't been an aberration or a moment of poor judgment on her part. It had been the most honest she'd ever been with me about how she actually viewed our relationship. The woman laughing and flirting across the room wasn't putting on an act for her colleagues. She was revealing who she really was when she felt free to be herself around people she wanted to impress. The version of her I'd been dating was the performance, carefully calibrated to keep me interested enough to stick around while never making me feel secure enough to expect more. I finished my bourbon in one slow sip, set the empty glass on the cocktail table with deliberate calm, and walked across the room towards Scarlett's group with the kind of quiet determination that comes from finally understanding a situation completely. When I reached her circle of colleagues, I waited for a natural pause in their conversation before stepping close enough for her to hear me clearly without creating a scene. I looked directly at her and said simply that it was no problem, keeping my voice level and my expression neutral, then turned and walked toward the exit without waiting for her response or offering any further explanation. The walk through the hotel lobby felt surreal, like I was moving through a movie scene where everything had suddenly shifted into slow motion, my footsteps echoing on the marble floor as I processed what I'd just done. I didn't look back to see if Scarlett had noticed my departure or if she was following me, because frankly it didn't matter anymore. The decision had crystallized in my mind with perfect clarity the moment I'd watched her transform herself for Derek's benefit. The cool December air hit my face as I stepped outside, and I realized I felt lighter than I had in months, like I'd been carrying a weight I hadn't even noticed until I set it down. I drove to Margaret's Diner, the 24-hour place near my apartment where I'd been going since college when I needed to think or couldn't sleep, pulling into the familiar parking lot and taking a moment to sit in my car before heading inside. Margaret, the elderly waitress who'd been working the night shift for probably 20 years, greeted me with the same warm smile she always did, asking if I wanted my usual coffee and piece of apple pie before I'd even settled into my regular booth by the window. There was something profoundly comforting about being in a place where someone remembered my preferences and treated me with genuine kindness, especially after spending the evening being made to feel invisible. The contrast between Margaret's easy warmth and Scarlett's calculated coldness hit me with startling clarity as I sat there eating pie and watching the occasional car pass by outside. Margaret had probably exchanged more meaningful words with me in 5 minutes than Scarlett had all evening, asking about my work on the new municipal building project and remembering that I'd been stressed about the deadline. Here was someone who barely knew me but treated me with basic human dignity and interest, while my girlfriend of 6 months had just spent an entire evening acting like my presence was an inconvenience she had to manage. My phone started buzzing around midnight, first with a text from Scarlett asking why I'd left, then increasingly frantic messages as she realized I wasn't responding immediately like I usually did when she reached out. I read each message as it came in but felt no urgency to respond, no familiar anxiety about leaving her waiting or wondering if I'd done something wrong. Instead, I typed out a single response telling her I'd found a place where I actually belonged, hit send, and then systematically blocked her number across all platforms before she could reply. The finality of that action felt surprisingly liberating rather than devastating, like closing the door on a room I'd been reluctant to leave but knew I needed to exit. I sat in that diner booth until almost 2 in the morning, drinking coffee and thinking about how many signs I'd ignored or rationalized away, how many times I'd convinced myself that her criticism was constructive or her distance was temporary. Margaret refilled my cup without being asked and told me to take care of myself when I finally left. Simple gestures of consideration that reminded me what normal human interaction was supposed to feel like. Driving home through the empty streets, I realized that tonight had given me something invaluable even though it hadn't been what I'd expected. It had shown me exactly who Scarlett was when she thought the stakes were high enough to matter. The woman who could dismiss me so casually at a work event wasn't someone having a bad night or dealing with professional pressure. She was someone who fundamentally didn't value me enough to defend or include me when it counted. The relief I felt about ending things completely told me everything I needed to know about how unhappy I'd actually been. The next morning brought a barrage of missed calls and voicemails from Scarlett, her voice progressing through confusion, irritation, and finally panic as she realized that my silence wasn't a dramatic gesture but a permanent decision. When her calls started going straight to voicemail and her texts showed as undelivered, I could practically feel her desperation through the phone as she left increasingly frantic messages demanding explanations and threatening to show up at my apartment if I didn't respond immediately. The power dynamic that had defined our entire relationship had shifted overnight, transforming her from someone who casually dismissed me to someone desperately seeking my attention. By noon, she had enlisted Ashley, her closest friend and work colleague, to reach out on her behalf, followed by Kevin, a mutual friend from college who I'd actually introduced her to in the first place. Ashley's initial text was carefully crafted to sound casual, asking if I was okay and mentioning that Scarlett seemed really worried about me, but I had anticipated this exact scenario and had already reached out to our shared social circle the night before. Kevin called me directly that afternoon, and I explained the situation honestly and calmly, describing what had happened at the party and why I decided to end things completely rather than engaging in drama or attempting to work things out. When Kevin confronted Scarlett about my version of events, her carefully constructed narrative of me just disappearing without explanation began to crumble under scrutiny. According to Kevin, she had been telling people that I'd gotten upset about something trivial and stormed out like a child, but when he pressed her about the specific details of our interaction, her story became vague and inconsistent. Ashley, who had witnessed the entire exchange at the party, eventually admitted to Kevin that she'd seen Scarlett pull me aside and speak to me harshly, though she claimed not to have heard the exact words that were exchanged. Scarlett's attempts to contact me through work channels failed spectacularly when she discovered that I had already updated my relationship status on social media and removed all traces of her from my professional profiles on LinkedIn and other platforms. Her call to my office was politely deflected by my assistant, who informed her that I was in meetings all day and couldn't be disturbed, a lie I'd prepared her with because I knew Scarlett well enough to predict she'd try every avenue available. The woman who had spent months keeping me compartmentalized away from her professional life was now desperately trying to infiltrate mine, the irony of which wasn't lost on me. What seemed to frustrate her most was the complete absence of drama or emotional outbursts from my end, according to the reports I received from our mutual friends who she continued to pump for information about my state of mind. She had apparently expected tears, begging phone calls, or at least angry confrontations that would give her opportunities to explain herself or negotiate some kind of reconciliation. Instead, she was met with a wall of polite but absolute silence that left her with no emotional leverage to manipulate or guilt to exploit. Kevin told me that Scarlett had spent an entire evening analyzing my behavior with Ashley, trying to figure out what she could have said or done differently to prevent my departure, but missing the fundamental point that the problem wasn't her specific words at the party but her entire approach to our relationship. She seemed genuinely confused by my reaction, as if she couldn't understand why being treated like an embarrassment would be a relationship-ending offense, suggesting that she viewed my feelings as something she could manage rather than something she needed to respect. The most telling detail Kevin shared was that Scarlett had asked him whether he thought I was seeing someone else, because surely that was the only explanation for why I would end a 6-month relationship so abruptly over what she characterized as a minor misunderstanding. The idea that I might have left purely because I recognized my own worth and refused to accept being treated poorly seemed genuinely incomprehensible to her, revealing just how little she had understood about either me or the dynamics of our relationship. Her desperation was palpable in every secondhand account I received, but it felt more like panic about losing control than actual remorse about hurting someone she claimed to care about. Word of the party incident began spreading through Scarlett's office within days, as several colleagues who had witnessed our brief interaction started questioning her treatment of me after putting the pieces together about who I was and why I had left so abruptly. Ashley inadvertently made things worse by trying to defend Scarlett's actions to their coworkers, accidentally revealing details about how Scarlett had been deliberately hiding our relationship to maintain her image as single and available. The revelation that she had been essentially living a double life at work, pretending to be unattached while dating me seriously for 6 months, damaged her credibility with colleagues who had trusted her authenticity. Derek, who had been enjoying Scarlett's flirtations and attention at office events for months, began distancing himself once the drama surrounding her relationship status became office gossip. According to Kevin, who heard this through Ashley, Derek had been under the impression that Scarlett was genuinely single and interested, making their workplace interactions feel suddenly inappropriate and potentially problematic for his own relationship. Other male colleagues who had been recipients of her charming attentions started viewing her behavior through a different lens, recognizing the calculated nature of interactions they had previously interpreted as genuine professional friendliness. The carefully constructed professional image Scarlett had been protecting by hiding me began crumbling when her boss, Linda, learned about the situation during a casual conversation with Ashley about holiday party etiquette. Linda had apparently been considering Scarlett for a promotion that involved client relationship management, but began questioning her judgment and integrity after learning about her deceptive behavior regarding her personal life. The irony was devastating. Scarlett had hidden me to protect her professional advancement, but the discovery of that deception became exactly the kind of character issue that derailed her career prospects. Meanwhile, my own life began flourishing in ways I hadn't expected once I was free from the constant undercurrent of criticism and disapproval that had characterized my relationship with Scarlett. I reconnected with old friends who admitted they had felt uncomfortable around her during the few times we'd all spent time together, describing her as dismissive and condescending toward both me and them. Mark, my college roommate, told me he'd always felt like Scarlett was evaluating him for some kind of social credit score whenever we hung out, making conversations feel like performances rather than genuine interactions. I started pursuing interests that Scarlett had subtly discouraged, beginning with photography classes I'd wanted to take for months but had avoided after she'd made comments about it being an expensive hobby for someone who wasn't naturally artistic. Joining the community theater group had been another dream deferred by her gentle but persistent suggestions that I focus on more practical pursuits that would advance my career, but now I found myself auditioning for a small role in their spring production and genuinely enjoying the creative collaboration with people who appreciated enthusiasm over expertise. The transformation in my confidence and mood was noticeable enough that colleagues at my architectural firm started commenting on it, with my project manager Sarah mentioning that I seemed more engaged and innovative in our design meetings. Without the constant mental energy required to navigate Scarlett's moods and manage her disappointment in my choices, I found myself more focused and creative at work, contributing ideas that impressed both clients and supervisors. The municipal building project that had been stressing me became a source of genuine excitement as I threw myself into creating something meaningful rather than just meeting deadlines. Most importantly, I began recognizing the patterns of emotional manipulation that had become so normalized in my relationship with Scarlett that I'd stopped noticing them consciously. The way she would praise me for things that benefited her while criticizing choices that were purely for my own enjoyment, how she'd create subtle competition with other couples to make me feel inadequate, and her habit of dismissing my feelings as overreactions whenever I tried to address problems in our relationship. Without that constant negativity draining my emotional reserves, I rediscovered parts of my personality that had been dormant for months, including my sense of humor and natural optimism that friends said they'd missed. 3 months later, I had completely rebuilt my social life around people who genuinely valued and respected me, including Claire, a talented set designer from the community theater group who shared my appreciation for both creative pursuits and practical problem solving. Our friendship had developed naturally through working together on the spring production, evolving into something deeper as we discovered our compatibility extended far beyond our shared interest in theater. Claire was everything Scarlett wasn't: confident without being arrogant, supportive without being manipulative, and genuinely interested in my thoughts and opinions rather than constantly evaluating whether my responses met her standards. The contrast became starkly apparent when Scarlett finally cornered me at Kevin's birthday party, an event I debated attending because I knew there was a chance she'd be there but ultimately decided not to let her presence dictate my social choices. She approached me near the kitchen while I was getting a drink, looking nervous and determined in a way that suggested she'd been planning this conversation for weeks. The transformation in her appearance was subtle but noticeable. She looked tired and less polished than usual, her confidence replaced by something that resembled genuine uncertainty rather than her typical calculated charm. Her attempts to explain her behavior at the holiday party fell completely flat as she offered justifications that revealed how little she understood about why I'd been hurt by her actions. She claimed that work politics were complicated and that I couldn't possibly understand the pressures she faced as one of the few young women in her department, suggesting that hiding our relationship had been a strategic necessity rather than a personal choice. When I calmly pointed out that other colleagues managed to maintain both professional credibility and public relationships, she became flustered and shifted to suggesting that we could try again with better communication and clearer boundaries. The conversation was witnessed by several of our former mutual friends, who later commented to me about how much healthier and happier I appeared compared to when I'd been dating Scarlett. Mark mentioned that he'd never seen me so relaxed and confident at social gatherings, noting that I'd spent the entire party engaging in genuine conversations rather than managing Scarlett's social needs or recovering from her subtle criticisms. The contrast was apparently obvious to everyone present, and several people mentioned feeling relieved that I'd ended a relationship that had clearly been draining my natural personality. What struck me most about the encounter was how completely indifferent I felt to Scarlett's presence and her attempts to rekindle something between us. The woman who had once made my heart race with excitement or anxiety now felt like a stranger whose problems were entirely separate from my life, and her emotional appeals carried no weight with someone who had learned to recognize manipulation tactics for what they were. When she suggested meeting for coffee to discuss things properly, I politely but firmly declined, explaining that I'd moved on completely and wasn't interested in revisiting a relationship that had run its natural course. The evening also provided an opportunity for Claire and me to attend our first social event together, and watching her interact with my friends confirmed everything I'd been feeling about our developing relationship. She was genuinely interested in getting to know the people who mattered to me, asked thoughtful questions about their lives and interests, and contributed to conversations in ways that enriched rather than dominated them. Several friends pulled me aside throughout the night to express how much they liked her and how well we seemed to complement each other, observations that felt validating after months of friends politely tolerating Scarlett's presence at gatherings. According to Ashley, who had remained friendly with Kevin and continued to provide occasional updates, Scarlett's relationship with Derek had already begun showing troubling patterns similar to what I'd experienced with her. Derek had apparently started complaining to colleagues about feeling embarrassed by Scarlett's behavior at client events, where she would become overly familiar with male clients and dismissive of their female partners. The irony of her reproducing the same dynamic that had destroyed our relationship, but from the other side, wasn't lost on me, though I felt only distant sympathy rather than satisfaction about her apparent inability to learn from the experience. 6 months post-breakup, I had fully processed the relationship and gained clear perspective on the patterns of emotional manipulation and public humiliation I had endured without fully recognizing them at the time. The distance allowed me to see how Scarlett had systematically undermined my confidence through constant subtle criticisms disguised as helpful suggestions, creating a dynamic where I was always striving to meet standards that shifted whenever I came close to achieving them. Her treatment of me at the holiday party hadn't been an aberration caused by work stress. It had been the most honest expression of how she actually viewed me throughout our entire relationship. My relationship with Claire had developed into something serious and meaningful, built on a foundation of mutual respect and genuine appreciation that made me realize how toxic my previous normal had become. Claire proudly introduced me to her colleagues and friends, treating our relationship as something to be celebrated rather than hidden, and her enthusiasm about sharing her life with me highlighted just how wrong Scarlett's approach had been. When Claire's firm held their annual summer picnic, she spent the entire afternoon introducing me to partners and clients with obvious pride, describing my work on the municipal building project with genuine interest and asking me to explain the architectural challenges to people who expressed curiosity. The contrast couldn't have been more stark. Where Scarlett had seen me as a liability to be managed, Claire saw me as an asset to be celebrated, and her colleagues responded positively to both my presence and her obvious happiness in the relationship. When my own firm's senior partners asked about my improved performance and increased confidence during my annual review, I credited learning to recognize my own worth and surrounding myself with people who supported rather than undermined my goals. The promotion and salary increase that followed felt like validation of choices I'd made to prioritize my mental health and personal growth over trying to salvage something that had never been healthy. Scarlett's attempts to rewrite history on social media backfired spectacularly when screenshots of her dismissive behavior and manipulative tactics began circulating among our mutual friends, shared by people who had witnessed her treatment of me and grown tired of her victim narrative. Ashley, apparently feeling guilty about enabling Scarlett's behavior for so long, had saved text message conversations where Scarlett explicitly discussed hiding me from her colleagues and complained about having to attend events with someone who didn't enhance her professional image. When these messages surfaced during a group chat argument about the holiday party incident, Scarlett's credibility was permanently damaged among people who had previously given her the benefit of the doubt. The revelation of her true feelings about our relationship, preserved in her own words, made it impossible for her to continue claiming that I had overreacted or misunderstood her intentions that night. Her eventual decision to delete her social media accounts temporarily only reinforced the impression that she had been caught in lies too significant to explain away, and the people who mattered most in my life finally understood why I had been so decisive about ending things without attempting reconciliation. Kevin later told me that reading those messages had made him ashamed of initially trying to convince me to give her another chance, recognizing that my assessment of the situation had been more accurate than anyone realized. My final reflection on the entire experience centered on the importance of being with someone who sees you as an asset rather than a liability, someone who wants to include you in their life rather than compartmentalize you away from the parts they consider important. The lesson that walking away from public humiliation had been the catalyst for finding genuine happiness and respect resonated far beyond romantic relationships, influencing how I approached friendships, professional connections, and family dynamics with healthier boundaries and higher standards. Claire often mentioned how much she appreciated my ability to recognize red flags and address problems directly rather than hoping they would resolve themselves, skills I had learned through the painful but ultimately valuable experience with Scarlett. Looking back, I realized that the holiday party had given me an unexpected gift by forcing Scarlett to reveal her true character when she thought the stakes were high enough to justify dropping her facade. Without that moment of brutal honesty about how she viewed me, I might have continued accepting treatment that slowly eroded my self-respect, convinced that her occasional warmth was worth enduring her consistent criticism. Instead, I learned that genuine love and respect aren't conditional on circumstances or audiences, and that the right person will be proud to claim you publicly rather than ashamed to be seen with you when it matters most.